I quit my job, emptied our joint savings account, and took out a second mortgage on our house to save my husband's failing business. The week his company got its first major contract, and he posted a photo of himself signing it on LinkedIn. He was standing next to his business partner. His hand was on her shoulder. They were smiling at each other in a way I hadn't seen him smile at me in years. I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called my best friend, who happened to be a family law attorney. My name is Joanna, and I'm 32 years old. My husband's name is Kevin. We met when we were both working entry-level jobs at a logistics firm in Mississauga. He had big ideas, which I loved about him. He wanted to start his own freight consulting company, something lean, tech-forward, built for the way supply chains were actually moving. I believed in him completely. When he laid out his business plan at our kitchen table one night, his eyes were lit up in a way that made me feel like I was watching someone finally become who they were supposed to be. We had been married 4 years at that point. We didn't have children yet, though we talked about it. In that comfortable way couples do when they assume the future is a given. We had a semi-detached in Brampton, a decent savings cushion, and 2 steady incomes. Not rich, but solid. Then the business started bleeding money. The first year, the losses were manageable. Kevin said it was the runway period, normal for any startup. I believed him. The second year, 2 of his anchor clients pulled out and he lost nearly $40,000 in contracts within a single quarter. He came home one evening and sat down at the kitchen table, and he didn't say anything for a long time. I sat across from him and waited. "We're going to lose it," he finally said. "The whole thing." He meant the business. But I heard it as something bigger, and I think he did too. I did not hesitate. I want to say that because people who hear this story later always ask if I had doubts, if I felt pressured, if I did it out of fear of losing him. I didn't. I did it because I loved him and I believed in what he had built, and I could not stomach the thought of watching something we had worked toward together collapse over a cash flow problem. So I said, "We are not going to lose it." I went back to work full-time at my old firm, where I'd shifted to part-time to help manage the administrative side of his company. I liquidated our TFSA and RRSP accounts, taking the tax hit on early withdrawal. I remortgaged the house, which required a hard conversation with our mortgage broker and a harder one with my mother. Kevin's parents offered a small amount, enough to cover 1 month of payroll, but the bulk of it came from me. I remember standing in the bank, signing the paperwork for the refinanced mortgage. The loan officer, a kind older woman, slid the documents across the desk and said, "Are you sure about this?" I said yes without looking up. My hand was completely steady. I think the steadiness surprised even me. Over the next 18 months, I ran both our household and quietly kept his business from imploding. I renegotiated his supplier contracts. I found a cheaper office sublease in Etobicoke. I handled his receivables when he was too exhausted or too proud to chase down late payments. Kevin worked incredibly hard too. I want to be fair about that. He pitched constantly, traveled for meetings, rebuilt client relationships that had frayed. We were a team, or I thought we were. The turnaround started slowly and then all at once. A major retail chain signed on as a distribution client, then a pharmaceutical wholesaler. By the spring of last year, the company wasn't just surviving, it was growing. Kevin hired 2 new staff. He moved into a proper office in downtown Toronto, glass doors, a meeting room with a whiteboard wall, the whole thing. I remember the day he sent me photos of the space, and I cried a little, just quietly at my desk at work, because it felt like something we had earned together. Her name was Francesca. She had come on as a business development consultant 8 months earlier. During the push to secure new contracts, Kevin had mentioned her the way you mention a colleague. Occasionally, practically, in the context of work. She was good at her job, he said. She had connections in the retail sector that were proving useful. Once, at a small gathering Kevin organized for the team at a restaurant in Liberty Village. She was confident and well-dressed, and she looked at my husband with an attention I filed away and chose not to examine. I should have examined it. The LinkedIn photo was the first crack in what I had been pretending was a solid surface. After I saw it, I started noticing other things. The way he would step outside to take certain calls. The slight shift in his energy when he came home from work, a kind of distracted brightness that had nothing to do with me. He started going to the gym again, something he'd let slip entirely during the hard years. He bought new clothes without mentioning it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself he had earned a little lightness after everything we'd been through. I told myself a lot of things that I no longer believe. The moment I stopped telling myself anything was a Tuesday evening in October. Kevin said he had a client dinner. I had a migraine and came home from work early, something I almost never did. His laptop was on the kitchen counter, which was unusual. He normally kept it in his bag. The screen wasn't locked. I wasn't going to look, and then I looked. The email thread was open. It wasn't hidden, which almost made it worse, like he'd stopped worrying enough to be careful. It was between Kevin and Francesca, and it went back months. The early messages were professional. Then they weren't. By the most recent ones, they were talking about a trip to Portugal they were planning for December, and about a property she'd seen listed in Oakville, a detached with a finished basement, good school zone. She'd written winking emoji. Good school zone. They were talking about schools. I closed the laptop. I sat down on the kitchen floor, which is a strange thing to do, but my legs just stopped working for a moment. I sat there for a while. Then I got up, made myself a cup of tea, and started thinking clearly for the first time in a long time. I did not cry. I want to be specific about that because I used to be someone who cried easily. At movies, at commercials, at stories on the radio about dogs reuniting with their owners. Sitting on that kitchen floor, and then at the kitchen table with my tea, I felt something cool and hard settle in my chest. I recognized it eventually as clarity. I called my best friend, Harriet, who had been practicing family law in Ontario for 6 years. It was 9:30 at night. She picked up on the second what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, come over. Bring everything you can access." I forwarded myself copies of the emails before I left. I also photographed 3 months of bank statements from our joint account that Kevin had printed and left in a drawer he thought I never opened. I had always opened it. I just hadn't been looking for anything until now. Harriet's apartment was 20 minutes away. We sat at her dining table with cold coffee and I told her everything from the beginning. The mortgage, the TFSA and RRSP withdrawals, the tax hit I'd taken, the supplier negotiations, the receivables I had managed, all of it. She took notes the entire time. Her face got very still and focused in the way it always does when she is building something in her head. When I finished, she set down her pen. "Joanna," she said, "what you contributed to this company's survival is documentable, all of it. The financial records, the remortgage, the account withdrawals, the work you performed. In Ontario, marriage is an economic partnership. The value of that business as it stands right now is a matrimonial asset." "I know," I said. "I want my share of it." "You're entitled to more than your share," she said. "Depending on what else we find," that was the beginning. I did not confront Kevin. This was the hardest decision I made through all of it because every part of me wanted to walk into the kitchen the next morning and lay it all out on the table. But Harriet had advised against it, and I trusted her judgment over my instincts. If he knew I knew, he would start moving things. Businesses can be undervalued on paper, assets can disappear into consulting fees and amortized expenses and shareholder loans. Kevin was smart. Francesca, I suspected, was smarter. So I kept being his wife. I made dinner. I asked about his days. I attended a company holiday party in November where Francesca was there, wearing a red dress, and she hugged me when we were introduced like we hadn't met before, or like she had decided we hadn't. I smiled and said it was lovely to meet her, and I watched her move through the room. Harriet connected me with a forensic accountant who specializes in small business valuations, a meticulous woman named Cecile, who agreed to review Kevin's company records for a preliminary assessment. I had legitimate access to some of these documents as a spouse, and others Harriet obtained through a formal disclosure request once we filed, which came later. Cecile found several things worth noting. There was a pattern of payments to a numbered company registered in Alberta that appeared to be providing minimal or undocumented services. The numbered company had been incorporated the previous spring. Harriet made some calls. The numbered company's director was a cousin of Francesca's. I sat with that information for 3 days before I could look at it without my hands going cold. Harriet said, "He was moving money out before serving you papers. He was trying to shrink the asset pool." I said, "How long?" She said, "The incorporation date suggests he started planning this around the time the business began turning a profit." I thought about the gym, the new clothes, the way his energy had shifted. He had been planning a new life and building it while I was still building the one we were supposed to share. I hired a licensed private investigator through a referral from Harriet's office. In Ontario, evidence has to be gathered lawfully to be admissible, and she was very clear with me about what I could and couldn't do. I was not going to jeopardize anything by crossing a line. The PI's name was just an initial on his email signature, T. He was efficient and discreet. Within 3 weeks, he had documented Kevin and Francesca meeting at her condo in the Distillery District on 4 separate occasions, including twice during times Kevin had told me he was with clients. The documentation was photographs of them entering and leaving together, time-stamped. Legal, clean. I also started quietly preparing for my own next chapter. I updated my resume, something I had let atrophy. I reached out to 2 former colleagues about a senior coordinator role I'd heard was opening up. I opened a personal checking account at a different bank, something I had never felt I needed to do. I began transferring a modest amount each paycheck. Nothing that would draw attention, just enough to ensure I would have a runway if things moved quickly. I kept reminding Kevin to go to his annual physical, something he always put off. When the doctor's office sent a reminder in November, I made the appointment on his behalf and told him I'd rescheduled it for a time that worked better. I wasn't trying to take care of him. I was making sure he was in documented, stable health because I didn't want any possibility later of chaos being attributed to stress I had caused. I was thinking several steps ahead of where we were standing. The confrontation happened on a Sunday morning in December, 2 weeks before the Portugal trip I had seen planned in those emails. Kevin had gone to pick up coffee and pastries from the Portuguese bakery on the main street. Our Sunday ritual, something's done since we moved to the neighborhood. When he came back and set the bag on the counter and started talking about maybe booking a ski weekend in February, I felt the last of whatever had been holding the performance in place simply release. I turned around and put a folder on the counter between us. Inside the folder was a printed copy of the email thread, the bank records showing the payments to the Alberta numbered company, the incorporation documents for that company with Francesca's cousin listed as director, a summary Cecile had prepared of the business valuation and the identified discrepancies, and at the back a cover letter from Harriet's firms. Kevin picked up the folder and opened it. I watched the color drain from his face as he read the first page. By the second page, he set the folder down and looked at me. He said, "Joanna." I said, "Don't," he said. "I can explain the business structure. The numbered company is for tax." I said, "Don't." He went quiet. We stood in our kitchen, in the house I had remortgaged to keep him afloat, and I let the silence run until it had said everything it needed to say. Then I told him that Harriet had already filed a notice of application for divorce that Friday, that a disclosure request had been issued to his company's accountant, that the forensic valuation was underway, that the PI's documentation was in Harriet's possession. Kevin's jaw tightened. "You went to a lawyer without talking to me first." "I remortgaged our house without making you feel bad about it," I said. "I guess we both did things without discussing them." He didn't have an answer for that. The next few months were not simple. He hired a lawyer, a litigator who specialized in making business valuations murky. There were weeks where the paperwork and the posturing and the counterfilings felt like a second full-time job. Kevin tried twice to negotiate privately, calling me on a Sunday evening with what he described as a reasonable offer, which was not reasonable. The second time I listened to him for about 90 seconds, and then I said, "Kevin, this is what lawyers are for," and I hung up. Francesca's connection to the numbered company created a significant problem for him. Once Cecile's analysis was complete and Harriet's team had traced the payment trail, it was clear that the funds diverted there represented value extracted from the business during the marriage. Under equalization in Ontario, that mattered. What he had been trying to do, quietly reduce the apparent value of the company while planning to exit the marriage, fell apart when it was documented. He couldn't unknow that I had evidence. He couldn't uninstate the disclosure process. And his own lawyer, I was told later, advised him to settle. The settlement was finalized 8 months after I put that folder on the counter. I received 40% of the assessed business value at its current worth, not the deflated version his accountant had initially put forward. I received half the equity in the house, which sold within 3 weeks of listing. I received equalization of the RRSP and TFS withdrawals, which had been documented down to the dollar by Cecile. I kept my personal savings account. I kept my car. He got the business. He got Francesca, I suppose, though I heard from a mutual acquaintance 6 months later that she had ended things. I felt nothing particular about that. What I felt something about was the afternoon I signed the final paperwork in Harriet's boardroom and walked out onto King Street in the late August heat and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. I had not cried once through the entire process. Not at the kitchen floor moment, not during the depositions, not when we sold the house and I packed up the last of my things into a rented van. It wasn't that I felt nothing. I felt everything, just compressed, like something under pressure that was keeping its shape because it had to. I cried for the first time in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire in Etobicoke. 3 days after the settlement was signed, I was there to buy shelf brackets for my new apartment. I sat in the car in the parking lot and cried for about 10 minutes, just full ugly crying, the kind that makes your face hurt. Then I went in and bought the shelf brackets. Medium pine, worked perfectly. My new apartment is a one-bedroom on the second floor of an older building in the West End of Toronto. It has good light and creaky floors and a radiator that ticks in the cold. I took a senior coordinator role at a company in the financial district that came through one of the colleagues I'd reached out to during the waiting period. The pay is better than my old job. The work uses parts of my brain that had been sitting idle for years. Some days I miss what I thought I had. Not Kevin specifically, but the version of the future I had built inside my head. The version where the hard years meant something, where the sacrifice added up to something permanent. Grief doesn't care whether you were wronged, it just shows up. But I also feel something I didn't have before. Something I didn't even know I was missing. A kind of lightness that has nothing to do with happiness, exactly, and everything to do with not carrying someone else's weight anymore. The house was remortgaged. The savings were drained. The years were spent. And I got through all of it. I got through it standing up, and I found out what I was made of in the process. On a Friday evening in October, almost exactly a year after I sat down on that kitchen floor, I met Harriet for dinner at a wine bar near her office. We split a bottle of something from the Niagara Peninsula, and she told me about a case she was working, and I told her about a project at my job that I was actually proud of. We talked for 3 hours. When we stepped outside, the street was lit with the particular orange gold of a Toronto fall, leaves still clinging to the trees on the boulevard. She looked at me and said, "You doing okay?" I thought about it genuinely, the way you only do when someone actually wants to know. "Yes," I said, "I actually am," and I meant it. Not as a performance, not as a reassurance, not as a story I was telling myself so I could keep moving. I meant it the way you mean a thing when you've earned the right to say it. I walked to the subway. The air was sharp and cold and clean. I put my earbuds in and took the train home, to the apartment that is small and mine, to the radiator that ticks and the floors that creak and the shelf brackets I put up myself. And I thought, this is the beginning, not of what I planned, but of what I built.